Good evening. Can everybody hear me? Welcome to the Center for Creative Photography. My name is Todd Tabutis, and I am the brand new director. I am in week 8, so I'm really, I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to be meeting everybody who is involved with the center, both inside and out, and I'm especially glad to be introducing tonight's program. To begin, we respectfully acknowledge that the University of Arizona is on the land and territories of indigenous peoples. Today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being home to the Hotham and the Yaqui. Committed to diversity and inclusion, the university strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign native nations and indigenous communities through education offerings, partnerships, and community service. It's also my great pleasure to begin by thanking all of the members of our director circle. The slide in front of you actually has all of the current members of that group. This group, members of whom their contributions are integral to strengthening and expanding CCP's core priorities. Many of them are here tonight. I want to thank all of them personally for that. And for those of you who are interested and want to join the director circle, one of the benefits is that every year members receive a limited edition portfolio print. We just unveiled it last night. Are you ready? Ta-da. Yes, it's a crowd pleaser. It's a javelina. This is an image from one of the photographs that was featured in the Linda McCartney retrospective exhibition that was recently here at CCP. And members, as I said, of the Director's Circle will all receive a print. And if you would like to join the Director's Circle, you too will get your own javelina. And I want to mention too that we topped 35,000 attendees for the McCartney retrospective. I also want to extend a huge thanks to CCP members whose support makes our exhibitions, programs, and educational offerings possible. I ask that if you want to join, please do so. Lastly, special thanks to Terry Etherton and Etherton Gallery for their support of our programming this fall. We will be hosting photographer and W.Eugene Smith's mentee, Takeshi Ishikawa, who will join us from Tokyo the early evening of October 12th. Thank you to Etherton Gallery and Terry for this collaboration in the program, and we invite you to join us again for that program in October. Okay, I'm not the talent tonight, so the brief outline is that we will be joined by Chief Curator Rebecca Senf, who will be giving a presentation titled 5 Things You Need to Know About W.Eugene Smith. She will come up to the podium. Then she'll be joined by Kevin Smith, who is the heir and director of the W.Eugene Smith estate, for a conversation about Smith, his life and legacy. They will open up the floor for a brief Q&A, and there will be somebody with a microphone who will come to you. You don't have to come to us. And then there will be a reception in the lobby and an opportunity to view the exhibition afterwards. So with that, I invite you to help me welcome Dr. Rebecca Senf to the podium.
All right. So nice to see you all here. It's really delightful to have so many people joining us to talk about Gene Smith. And so as Todd mentioned, I'm going to give a short presentation, maybe 30 minutes. Then Kevin and I will have a discussion, and then we'll open the floor to Q&A. So we'll ask you to hold your questions until then. I do want to just hit on a couple of notes. As you may have seen on the title slide, we are going to cover some tough issues. You're going to see some tough images. I think this is the kind of place where we should be doing that, and I hope you'll participate in a discussion as we think about these hard images. So that's your second warning notice. The Center's W.Eugene Smith archive is really exceptional, both in its size, but in many ways it is the epitome of an archive. He was here in Tucson when he passed, and so the archive includes all manner of objects, notes, negatives, proof prints, contact sheets, research materials, personal items, furniture. So we've drawn on some of that archival material both in the lecture and in the exhibition. But it's that kind of archival material and the way of collecting that makes the CCP different and distinct from other institutions. And so as we think about Gene Smith, remember that we here at the CCP have the benefit of that archive, and many other scholars too have come to the center to use those materials to help deepen their understanding of Gene Smith. The collection of fine prints that we have here from which this exhibition is drawn is about 2,600 prints. Then I also want to mention the center's audio guide. It's called the CCP Interactive. You can download it on your smartphone or access it through the web on the center's website. It includes special content that complements the show, including video interviews, special audio, additional photographs. So I would encourage you to look at that. And then there are 2 publications that come with the exhibition: a general biography of Gene Smith that's in this brochure, free in the exhibition, and then this zine about the center's collection of Hitachi contemporary Japanese photography. And so this is a really wonderful booklet that shows an exhibition that we did at Phoenix Art Museum of this collection of Japanese photography, also available to you. And then finally, I just want to point out that no exhibition or program like the one this evening happens without a huge team of people who all work together. I am incredibly grateful for the support of the CCP staff and all the many people we work with outside the CCP to make these exhibitions and programs possible. So thank you very much to my colleagues. All right, let's get going. So I've organized this as a BuzzFeed list of the things you need to know about Gene Smith. Of course, there are many things to know, but we're going to hit 5 things that I think are important. So we're going to start with the fact that Smith's experience covering World War II atrocities changed how he thought about his role and mission as a photographer. So one of the things I've included in tonight's presentation are all these fabulous portraits of Gene Smith from the archive. As I was preparing the presentation, I knew I needed to keep it brief and concise, but then I would see a portrait like this and I just couldn't help myself. I feel like seeing pictures of people at different points in their lives tells us so much about them. So here's a picture of Gene Smith in 1938. He was 20 years old at this point. And these are pictures at the beginning of his service photographing in World War II. So he began actually stationed on an aircraft carrier, and at that time was making mostly aerial photographs, like these ones. So he's actually flying along with the pilots who are stationed on that aircraft carrier, and he's able to make photographs as he's joining them on their missions. I find these photographs incredibly compelling, and when you think about how limited his ability was to be in control of what's in front of his camera, they feel all the more powerful and intense to me. For him, it was really important to photograph in the war. At this point in his life, he felt like it was the way that he could have the greatest impact, and so it was very important to him. He's in the Pacific Theater as he's covering the war, but what he really wanted to do was to be on the front lines because he felt like that was the place he could have the most impact. So he ends up making pictures like this and is able to get the kind of intensity and closeness that he's looking for, that he was missing from those aerial views. Some of the pictures are very hard. And when he was making photographs like this, it felt really important to him that he become the witness of the war that most of the people of the world were not seeing. And so he took on this incredible responsibility to make sure that people understood what was happening. He knew that most people didn't understand just how terrible war was, and so he wanted to make sure that he could create a record that would outlast him and that would be an argument against this kind of unbelievable harm that was happening. He actually wrote about it quite extensively, and I want to read a little bit from this page, which actually appears in the exhibition. He writes, "For these people of the pictures were my family, reflected in the tortured faces of another race. Accident of birth, accident of home, the bloody dying child I held momentarily while her life fluid seeped through my shirt and burned my heart, that child was my child. And each time I pressed the shutter release, it was a shouted condemnation hurled with the hope that the pictures might survive through the years and at least echo through the minds of men in the future. So these experiences for him really transformed what he thought the medium of photography could do, and it created in him a mission and a responsibility that he carried forward from that point on. So the second thing to know is that service, photographing during the war, caused injuries, both mental injuries, what we would now call PTSD, and physical injuries that changed the rest of his life. So naturally, when you're covering war, you are not immune to the same kinds of threats and dangers that the soldiers are. He's making this picture when he's stationed on the aircraft carrier. And he makes pictures like this one. And this photograph is actually of training maneuvers. So this is not during active combat, but it was a scene like this that I think about when he was actually injured. So he was covering infantryman Terry Moore for Life magazine, a story about a day in the life of one of the infantrymen. And at one point, all the soldiers dropped down because there were mortars going off, and Gene Smith stood up in order to get the soldiers against the action behind them, and a shell went off near him, and little bits of metal flew into his hand, which was up focusing the camera lens, into his face. It damaged the roof of his mouth and hit his back. And while he had surgery to repair those injuries, and I have a portrait of him after he was wounded, the injuries were never properly repaired, and in particular, the damage to the roof of his mouth meant that it was hard for him to eat for the rest of his life. And you can imagine that when it's hard to eat, it's hard to be nourished, it's hard to have the right energy and nutrition, and the combination of that and the self-medicating from the PTSD, which we didn't treat in those years that same way that we are able to now, meant that he developed an alcohol addiction. He was addicted to Benzedrine, which at the time was available over the counter as a decongestant, but the combination of alcohol and amphetamines allowed him to work without the constant source of food that most of us rely on to keep us going. So those things really impacted his both physical health and his mental health, and it's something that we see creating challenges and chaos as his life progresses from this point forward. So many of you will know Smith from the work he did for Life magazine. This was a period of his own career that had the hugest impact. This is an opportunity for him to create photographs that are circulated to over 1 million homes when he's working for Life magazine. And he does a series of photo essays that produce these incredibly iconic photographs, and for which he is very well known. So here's a portrait of Smith when he's working on the Country Doctor piece. He's reading the shooting script that's been provided to him by one of his editors. So this is a list, a document that outlines what kinds of pictures they'd like him to produce for the Country Doctor piece. And here are two of the very famous photographs that come from that particular essay. And this is a letter that was sent to him by the London office after he produced the Country Doctor, and I'm going to read you just a little bit of this. Dear Gene, thought you might like to hear that the minute your doctor's story hit the London office, it roused a burst of excitement at great pictures in the book again, and long discussion on how it gets done. We're also full of admiration for the Broadway cover story, but the Doctor one proves so nicely what can be done with an old theme tackled the right way. This part, next part, I think is kind of funny. So please, will you settle our argument? Exactly how long did you spend on the story? We've got a little pool on. So they're betting in the London office about just how long Gene Smith spent working on this particular project. He was known to say that he was going to take a certain amount of time and then take more than that, maybe double or triple the amount of time he was given. So they're talking about and joking about how long it took him. And then at the end it says, I don't know why I said again in the first sentence. I don't think there's ever been a better set of pictures. So I know that this meant a lot for Gene Smith to be commended by his colleagues like this. But he continues to make these incredible photo essays. And in particular, his contribution was to this concept of the essay. So rather than making individual pictures that told you about something, he was interested in doing research on the subject and then creating the photographs that together produced a story that they worked in synergy with the captions in the magazine to convey a larger idea. And this was a form that he was particularly good at and really helped bring to a new height during his years at Life magazine. So these are all from the Spanish Village essay. Here's another portrait of him looking very serious, very elegant. And then he works on the nurse midwife essay, which is the one that we feature in the exhibition. And this is about the nurse midwife Maud Callan. And she would bring him around to her visits with various patients as she was delivering babies, or in the case on the right-hand side of the screen, doing an inoculation clinic where kids were coming in and she would provide shots. She was the primary caregiver for a county that was incredibly under-resourced. There were no paved roads in her entire county, so she was the person who was training other women to deliver babies and providing health care. There are some great pictures of Smith working on this project. If any of you have given birth yourself or been in the room where someone is giving birth, you know what an intimate space that is. Maud Callan would go to her patients and she would introduce Gene Smith and say, "This is Mr. Smith, he's working with me." And through her close relationship with her patients, they would allow him in to these spaces. But I love pictures like this. This is the laboring mother in the foreground, and that's Gene Smith. The room is so small that he's leaning out the window in order to get some distance on the scene in order to photograph it. And here's another example where he's literally right over the woman as she's laboring. And so you get a sense of the kind of trust that he had with Maud Callan, that she has with her patients, and then that the patients extend to him through their trust in their midwife. And this was an incredibly important essay for Gene Smith. What ends up happening is in the story, he mentions that she wishes to build a clinic in her county to serve the patients, but that there's not the money for it. And so they do the piece, and it runs in the magazine, and this is from the letters to the editor. They're all incredibly moving, but I'm going to read you the one that's at the top right. And Lucille Holtquist writes, "Sirs, I have been saving for a new rug, but after I read about Maud Callan, the rug no longer seemed important. The enclosed check will not build a clinic, but she will find use for it." So the Life magazine readers sent in so much money that it exceeded the $7,000 she needed for the clinic, and she was actually able to build a clinic with the money that came in from the results of the story. So for Gene Smith, this felt like such a triumph and such a demonstration that the pictures could make a difference. You could literally use the photographs to help people understand what was happening in a way that they then were moved to participate. Oh, there's the close-up of that, one of the letters. So he's got this great job at Life magazine where the pictures that he wants to change the world are reaching millions of people. And what does he do? He quits. So he was working on a photo essay of Albert Schweitzer, who had built a hospital for treating patients with leprosy. And he spent many months with Dr. Schweitzer and photographing the people who lived in this hospital complex. And the story, like all of Gene Smith's stories, was incredibly important to him. It was very heartfelt. And so when he came back to the editors, he had a particular idea about how he wanted the piece to look, and he couldn't get the editors to do what he wanted. And so he writes a letter to Albert Schweitzer. It's here. I'll read to you from it. It's from November 16th, 1954. "Dear Dr. Schweitzer, I shall be very brief, for silence must guard the bitterness of my mind, the hurt of my heart, which comes from the intensity of my dislike for the way that the photographs of you and your hospital were used by Life magazine. Someday, somehow, I wish that you could see the entire set of photographs, but for now at least, this is impossible, as another set of prints would take at least 3 months for me to make. My name appears with the story in Life, It is a usage of my work, and no matter how unfortunately it was done, I must accept the responsibility for it. I can but say that I fought as hard, as completely as I could, and when I left, which I did, I resigned from the magazine, a relationship that began during my 19th year of age. And so it ends, that phase, and I place my sincere regrets before you. So his integrity was more important to him than access to that huge audience. And so ultimately he decided that he needed to leave life because he couldn't abide by the relationship that he had with his editors. So after that, he goes on, he joins Magnum Agency, which many of you have probably heard of, and he works with them. He gets an assignment to photograph in Pittsburgh and makes an amazing set of photographs. It's meant to chronicle the city for one of their anniversaries. And again, as he is wont to do, the project expands from being 100 or 200 pictures to hundreds of pictures, and from 4 weeks, 6 weeks to many months. And the project grows and grows, and he can't get it published because it gets so large that it expands beyond the intentions of the original commission. I think the pictures are really fabulous. There's a book in the exhibition reading area that talks about the Pittsburgh project, so you can go through and look at a range of the photographs. But these are some untitled examples. He photographs both the physical plant, the city, its landscape, its bridges, its rivers, as well as the people in all different jobs, in different walks of life. He also, of course, focuses on the steel industry as part of his coverage of Pittsburgh. So pictures like this, which are on the banner outside the building, are part of that Pittsburgh coverage. We, again, are seeing that none of Smith's graphic power or compositional talent are waning at all in these years that he's working in Pittsburgh. There's another group where you're seeing in the upper left a picture of the landscape. He's photographing here on the right in a country club or a high-end restaurant. He's photographing in banks and libraries to show the institutions of Pittsburgh. And this picture in the lower right is called Dream Street, where he's thinking about these metaphorical ways of representing the city as well. After he is unable to get Pittsburgh published the way he imagines, he moves to New York City. He leaves his family and moves into a space in New York. I had the address right here, 821 6th Avenue in New York City. It's part of the Flower District, and it's an area that he is neighboring with jazz musicians. And so he gets fascinated by the jam sessions that are happening after the bars close at night. So starting at 2 a.m., it turns out that his neighbor, Hall Overton, had a tuned piano and a drum set. And if you had a tuned piano and a drum set, that attracted musicians. So the piano players and drummers would come, and then horn players would filter in, and they would rehearse or they would jam. And during these years, Smith got really interested in documenting this environment of what was called the jazz loft. So he literally drilled holes in the floor and the ceiling and the walls of his space, and then wired it so he could record the sessions going on around him. And that amounted to 1,700 hours of reel-to-reel recordings that are part of the CCP archive. And we have a tiny sampling of that in the gallery space. Many thanks to Emmy for compiling that, where you get to hear some of the jazz musicians practicing. I'm going to come back to this. I'm going to show you jazz musician. Thelonious Monk practicing. You get to hear some of the television and radio that he's obsessively recording at this time. He also is monologuing into the microphone, so you get to hear some of him talking about his own experiences. So it was this obsessive approach to documenting the space. So it included pictures of jazz musicians, but he was also photographing out that window. Actually, I'm going to go back one more. So here he is in the jazz loft photographing down onto the street, and he's making pictures like this one. And please do find this print in the exhibition. is one of the most gorgeous photographs you will ever see. It is really stunningly beautiful, beautifully printed, and both exploration of tonal values and this view from the loft down onto the street on a snowy evening or maybe early morning. And so he's almost using the loft like a camera, like he's inside the camera and documenting things that are happening around him. This is another view of the loft. So the loft was a very storied place. It was not the tidiest. Kevin can tell more about what it was like visiting the loft as a kid. There were cats who would come in and out. I can attest to the fact that among the prints we have in the collection at the center, there is one that very distinctly has a paw print, like a little schmutzy paw print on the surface of the print. And you can see why. I mean, here are literally mounted prints, and the cat is bedding down right on top of them. Here's a great portrait by David Vestal of Gene Smith in that space. So you get a sense of the crowdedness. He's filling it with images. He has a dark room in this space. And in the film, we have a clip of the film Minamata playing in the gallery space, and it's a scene from this location, his jazz loft space. So you get a sense of Johnny Depp as Gene Smith moving around in that jazz loft space. So he's working at Jazz Loft, he's making pictures, but he doesn't have the outlet of Life magazine anymore. And Magnum, it's not really working for him to produce much for Magnum. He does still work for Life on occasion, but he's working on a giant retrospective exhibition. And in the process of working on this, he meets Eileen Smith. And this is Eileen and Gene Smith around 1971. They meet in 1970, and she begins to work with him, assisting him on the production of the prints for this big exhibition. And their relationship moves very rapidly, and they begin to fall in love. And Gene Smith gets invited to come to Japan. Eileen is Japanese American and a translator between English and Japanese. They get invited to go to Japan because Gene learns about Minamata and what's happening in the town of Minamata, a village, small fishing village in Japan. So it's near to the chemical company Chiso, and Chiso is dumping their wastewater into Minamata Bay. And that wastewater is polluted with mercury. So the fish are eating the mercury, the villagers are eating the fish, and it's causing disease in the villagers, really debilitating disease. So in children, when mothers are pregnant and they eat fish with mercury in it, that passes through the placenta to the child, but not back out of the placenta to the mother. All the mercury gets concentrated in the child and causes terrible congenital defects in the unborn children. It also causes all kinds of neurological problems for adults and children who eat the poisoned fish. And so Gene and Eileen learn about this, and they're enticed to go to Minamata to document what's happening there. They're married while they're in Japan. You can see from the picture there's a large age discrepancy. But Eileen, I think, was completely captivated by Gene's intensity. And she talks about what he was like as a teacher, that you never felt like you were being taught. It was just that he couldn't help but share how he felt about photography, both the technical components and the larger philosophical components, and that she was enveloped in all of that amazing fervor that he had for what he did and how he was living his life. So these are two photographs that were ultimately published in Life magazine. Life took an interest in the story and decided to run it, even though Gene Smith was no longer a Life staff photographer. So what you're seeing on the left is a picture of Chiso's industrial waste pouring into Minamata Bay, and then it's paired with pictures like this one on the right of the villagers fishing, so that there's this very direct link for readers that the actions of the company were the thing that was poisoning the villagers. There are pictures of villagers who are suffering from the effects of having consumed the mercury produced by Chiso. And so Gene Smith makes pictures like this one. But then he's also documenting the protests and the way in which the villagers of Minamata are pushing back against Chisso Corporation and asking to be compensated and to be recognized, and for the damage that the company did to be offset, for reparations to be made. And so this relatively small group of villagers are coming up against this big company, and that was part of what Jean and Eileen were documenting. So she was there as a translator, but also she was photographing and assisting Jean with printing and all of the elements of the larger practice of documenting what's happening in Minamata. As I said, there's a film that was produced. It was released in 2020, starring Johnny Depp. It was directed by Andrew Levitas, and it discusses the impact of Minamata and the damage that happened to the people in the town of Minamata. And you can stream it. It's available. You can watch it. But we've got in the exhibition a small clip from the film, and then we interviewed director Andrew Levitas and the cinematographer Benoit Delhomme, and so they talk about what it was like to recreate Gene Smith's life using resources from the CCP archive as part of how they understood him. Of course, they worked with Eileen and with Kevin as well to better understand Gene Smith, but that allowed them to, they literally used strips of film from the CCP archive to recreate things to use in the film. So we have that little clip in the exhibition as well. So I think with that, I would like to invite Kevin to join me, and we'll move here and have a little conversation. So be thinking about what questions you might like to ask us.
You've left me with nothing left to say. Everything. I agree with everything Becky just said. So, questions?
No. You've got a perspective that I don't have. So since I frame this as the things that I thought people needed to know about your dad, I'm wondering if there are things that you would add that you feel like people need to know about Gene Smith.
Well, as with many well-known people or larger-than-life people, there's definitely a difference between the public or the historical image and the actual person. And one example of this is, we can start with the end and work back perhaps, but with the film Minamata, which I think is, I would recommend everyone see. It's available by streaming on Hulu and Amazon Prime, etc., is that it makes him, and this is kind of the legend, it makes him seem like a very difficult, irascible character. And certainly, I'm sure many of his editors, especially at Life magazine, might agree with that view. But from my perspective, that is atypical. And this is not intended to be, the movie itself, it's based on a true story, and we kind of all know what that means in Hollywood, right? About half of it's true and half of it's not. And intentionally so for dramatic effect. But in real life, my experience with him, and I think others as well, he was very soft-spoken, he was very charming, he was very funny, he never raised his voice, he never swore. I never heard him use a curse word. Every other word in the movie is a curse word, right? People are not really aware of that side of him. There are some, candid cameo shots, film, old footage of him in various settings where he's giving a talk or interacting with people that kind of shows that. As Becky mentioned, because of his war wound, he kind of had a false roof of his mouth, and that made him kind of, partly it was the reason he was soft-spoken. He talked with kind of a lisp almost, and slurred his words. And again, another misperception is that people thought that was due to alcohol. It was not. And I'm not denying that he had a substance abuse issue, but not in his sort of daily life. And so people would listen to him and go, oh, he sounds like he's drunk. No, he had an injury to the roof of his mouth. One thing Eileen herself had mentioned, about him, and is a little bit hard to find in the movie itself. He always had this twinkle in his eye. He had this impishness to him that is just not part of the public persona that's often perceived. So those are my initial observations.
Excellent. I think that's really helpful to hear. And I mean, I think that maybe, I'm just reflecting on what you said, that the nuance of the kind of integrity that he clearly carried through his entire life, that we simplistically equate that with a kind of brashness or an aggressiveness even. But it's interesting to think about it being paired with a more, a kind of a quieter demeanor. And I feel like that Schweitzer letter really reflects that, that when confronted with a situation that he could not endure, he couldn't get it the way he wanted, what he did is he walked away from it. And that was his response to it.
Well, there's certainly no question that he was a demanding character in terms of his professional life. I mean, he, with some good reason, he thought nobody else knew better than he did what his prints should look like, what his story should be, and he was very passionate in his defense of that. He took more and more liberties, certainly, with Life magazine, and as Becky referred to, the time he would spend on each story sort of expanded exponentially as they went along. But it's sort of another aspect of what I was just talking about is that, again, this portrayal of him as kind of this impossible, irascible character. These photographs, starting with the country doctor and then going all the way through to Minamata and Tomoko's family, his trademark or hallmark was to embed himself with the subjects for longer and longer periods of time. He would stay with them. He would, live with them. He stayed sometimes with Dr. Siriani, with the country doctor. The Spanish, was the Spanish wake shown in this?
Yes.
The scene with the patron of the family at the wake, deceased with the family around. They invited him in. He was out in the street. He'd been in De La Tosa, Spain for, I think, about 6 weeks, 2 months, something like that. He was out in the street taking scenes of the town, whatever. And he had developed such a rapport with these people and with his family that one of the daughters said, we're having a wake for our father inside. Would you like to come in and take a few pictures? And then again, with Minamata at the very end, and there's an audio clip of on the website of Eileen discussing how that photograph came about. But he didn't just, that was about 3 or 4 months after they arrived there with Tomoko's family. He didn't just rush in and say, oh, could you pose with Tomoko in the bath? It took several months of building trust, gaining trust. The family, understandably, was rather shy and concerned about having that image portrayed of their disabled daughter. And so this is totally inconsistent with the idea that he was just this jerk, like a bull in a china shop, blundering around. So I would just add that.
Yeah, I want to go back to this idea of the archive and the way that the archive reflects a kind of complexity and with all of these different materials, also reflects the chaos, that for Gene Smith, the last years of his life, maybe even you could may be able to say the last decades of his life were really difficult. He was struggling with mental health issues. He was struggling, his physical health he was struggling with. And so we included in the exhibition a locker that is part of the archive where he's actually graffitied the locker that was in his own space. And you see him wordsmithing the graffiti, which I think is a kind of interesting and curious thing to imagine doing. And you see his handwriting. Handwriting, of course, is also very telling. And so as we designed the exhibition, we were thinking about the way in which the prints are so pristine and were given such care. And the exhibition conveys that perfectionism and the way in which the prints were the pinnacle and the outcome of all of that struggle and hard work for him. But that underneath, almost like an iceberg, there's a churn, there's a chaos, there's a challenge, there's a struggle that's happening. And I like the way in which the archive is able to reflect that. But I wonder if you can speak from your own experience about this idea of the challenge and the chaos and the complexity, and then the pictures sitting up on top of that.
Yeah, the interesting thing, and where I can maybe fill in the blank a little bit, is that the period when I knew him best is the period that most people knew him the least. And so it was in this, mostly this kind of from the window jazz loft period in the late 50s and into the late 60s, basically, roughly 8 or 10 year span. And that's kind of, that was really his down and out period, right? And so he made it through Pittsburgh, which I think is just a, it's actually my favorite of his photo essays, but if you spend 3 years taking 11,000 negatives, you're going to come out with some pretty good stuff, right? I wouldn't recommend it, by the way, especially if you're not really getting paid for it. But anyway, after that, people kind of lost track of him. He did a few freelance photo essays. He went to Haiti. He did Hitachi in that period for more or less a year in Japan. But mostly he was holed up in the loft from roughly 1958 to 1969. And people weren't, and he didn't have much money, and his family was kind of all splintered apart. I'm the youngest of 5. I have a different mother than the other 4. I was living in with my mother in Philadelphia. So I was not living with him, but just a short train ride up to New York. So he'd come down periodically, but mostly I'd go up and I'd stay in the loft. That's where somewhere behind the stacks of photos and the 6,000 record albums and all the cats and stuff. There was like a small bed crammed into a corner somewhere that I vaguely recall. But yeah, I was roughly between when I was about 8 years, well, maybe a little earlier, about 8 years old to 16 or 17 years old. That's mostly when I was going back and forth, and that was during that period. So I have very vivid memories of that loft. I was not there for the musicians. I think they were mostly in the late 50s, and at least when I was there, I didn't hear the jam sessions going on the floor above. But I was really delighted then when, with the help of CCP, and Sam Stevenson, who was then with the Center for Documentary Studies. And those 2 books have just been reissued this year by the University of Chicago Press. One is called Dream Street of All the Pittsburgh Photos, and the other is called The Jazz Loft Project. It kind of filled in that era that most people didn't know what he was doing, and he didn't really take those jazz loft photos. They weren't really master prints, right? They mostly were like almost what we would call like snapshots or home photos. He would just, in the middle of the night, folks were, these musicians were there till 3, 4 in the morning and smoking dope and drinking and stuff. And he just had candid shots. He was just, people were on the sofa and playing music. And I was so glad that period got resurrected because that's really what I remember most. And those audio tapes are actually the 10-part radio series that WNYC, the public radio station, that's still available free online. There were 10-hour-long episodes that is probably the best place to actually listen to some of the better recordings that were made during that period.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. I didn't realize that, and that's good to know. I'm sure there are going to be people who will want to dig deeper in that. And both the Dream Street book and the Jazz Loft book are in the exhibition in the reading area, so people can preview those if they're interested in learning more about them. So you and I both had the pleasure of being in Japan together when an earlier version of this exhibition was shown at the Tokyo Museum of Photography. This is not the first time that Kevin and I have been on a panel together talking about his dad. Your dad is revered in Japan. And so I wondered if you wanted to talk at all about his importance in Japan and maybe even your experience in Japan subsequently.
Sure. So I had the privilege. I've had a bunch of different careers, but I was doing various types of television news reporting and production for about 20 years. And one of those assignments took me to Tokyo for 2 years I was working as a reporter for kind of a pilot program, English language program that NHK, the big powerhouse Japanese TV network, was producing back in the 90s. And so I got to live there in Tokyo and work in this kind of bilingual setting for a major Japanese media company. And I would definitely say it's amazing to me. People in the United States, most people, especially if they lived through the Life magazine era, they're familiar with the photographs, right? So sometimes I'm at a gathering or something, and somebody introduces me and goes, "Oh, this is Eugene Smith's son, Kevin," and I usually get blank stares, right? And I go, "Who? Oh, the famous photographer. Oh, what kind of photos did he take?" And I, rather than sort of go into like the whole explanation, I kind of say, well. His name, you may not know the name, but just go to like Google Images and put in W.Eugene Smith, and you'll see like 50 photographs you probably recognize. In Japan, he is a household name. At least he certainly was when I was there. I don't know about the young people. Mostly due to Minamata, not entirely, but mostly due to Minamata, which was all over the headlines there, and he really was given the credit for exposing that situation. But when I got introduced, even casually around Japan, almost everybody knew who he was. And I'll just tell one very quick anecdote. There was there's a tiny little really old section of Tokyo called Golden Gai. It's right next to the most bustling train station in the world, the neon lit Shinjuku area, and it's just this little network, rabbit warren of old 6-stool bars that have been in the families, for pre-World War II, really. And I had befriended a Japanese newspaper reporter, and he took me around to a couple of bars in Golden Gai. And so he introduced me to the barkeeper, Gene Smith's son. And this gentleman who didn't speak a word of English, he pulls out a copy of the book, Let Truth Be the Prejudice, from underneath his bar. and it's like, the hardbound copy of the Aperture book from 1985. And this is just a totally random encounter. And it just sort of shows the extent to which, he's revered over there.
Yeah. Oh. Excellent story. I love that. So I'm warning you all, this is my last question to Kevin, so be prepared with your questions for us. So I want to ask about his legacy. What would you say 45 years after his death, his career and his work means now?
Yeah, so perfect last question. So many of you may be aware that he died here in Tucson in 1978. 2 years later, a bunch of his professional friends and colleagues started the W.Eugene Smith Memorial Fund in Humanistic Photography, which is still thriving to this day. And its purpose was to award grants to photographers who were continuing on work and projects in his image and that reflected his particular passions and pursuits, and hence the title Humanistic Photography. So this gets full circle back to where Becky started with the World War II and how that influenced his later work and projects. It did very much affect him. His sort of cliche, like that book title, Let Truth Be the Prejudice, it's a cliche, and that means different things to different people. And I've been in discussions recently sometimes with objective versus subjective journalism, which I was in, as I said, TV news for 20 years. So I have views that there's no such thing as objective journalism. And maybe I'll offend people. Even if you're an editor for the local paper, you're deciding what story to put above the fold, below the fold. You're the local reporter covering the city council meeting. One newspaper might lead with this topic, and the other newspaper might lead with a totally different topic. And it's all subjective, what to include, who to interview, what quotes to use, what to leave out. So to me, the prejudice is what the subjective take is that the journalist, or in this case the photojournalist, brings to it. But he started with World War II. Most of those photos are not like U.S. wartime propaganda photos. They did have to get past the censors, so not all of them saw the light of day, obviously. But he did when he could. He tried to take photos of just civilians on these Pacific islands who were adversely impacted, terrified, wounded. He took photos of wounded soldiers suffering that obviously were not really geared toward propaganda at the time. And it just became more and more as he went on. I mean, he went to Spain. It didn't really turn out this way because some people said the pictures were too beautiful. When he went to Spain, he was basically trying to do an anti-Franco story. And mind you, he was doing this for Henry Luce's Life magazine, and Henry and Claire Booth Luce were certainly not what we would call woke today. The opposite, but nonetheless, they let his stories appear. He only, in Spanish Village, mostly he was showing the poverty that was inflicted by the Franco regime. That's why he picked this poor little town of De La Tosa. But the only really anti-Franco shot was that, and I don't think it was reflected, with the three soldiers, the Guardia Civil, the very stern-faced soldiers with the weapons. And even the captions in Life magazine, I just had occasion to look at them again recently. I was surprised how strong they were. They're basically basically how this is the Guardia Civil, who rule, Franco's way to rule these people and keep them in poverty, rule them with an iron thumb so nobody steps out of line. I thought, well, this is kind of interesting. And then I would just have to add, because Nurse and Midwife is the featured story, and then we'll go to the questions. I'm really glad you chose that, because in terms of the actual impact, other than Minamata itself at the very end, in terms of actual impact of his photography changing the situation, and Becky alluded to this, it actually got Maud her clinic built because people, unsolicited, it didn't say send your money, and there was no website, right? But she got enough money from people who read this in Life magazine and just sent in donations. But you have to remember the time. This was 1951. This is the height of Jim Crow. This is before Brown versus Board of Education and school integration, and it was the white bathroom, colored bathroom, buses, and up until this point, I believe this is correct. I've read this before. Up until this point, no major U.S. media had ever done mainstream had ever done a story just on ordinary black people. I mean, the only black people portrayed in the media, were entertainers, sports figures, celebrities, and this was truly a landmark, historic thing for a publication, especially of the import of Life magazine, to be putting in its issue, and that to me was the game changer.
Excellent. I really appreciate your perspective on this, and clearly, you see your dad both through the lens of being a family relation, but clearly you've thought a lot also about his role as a photographer and as a photojournalist. So I think that's incredibly helpful. We'll take some questions from the audience. We'd ask you to wait until you get the microphone so that we can hear it. Does anyone have a question for us? Yep, Dr. Schaefer has a question.
It's really more of a comment than a question. One of the things that we sort of take for granted is that Ansel Adams was the greatest printer of black and white photographs in the last century. Don't sell Eugene Smith short. If you were to make contact prints of a lot of the photographs you've seen, you would wonder, how on earth did he get that image out of this negative? He was a great printer, a really great printer, and didn't hesitate to subject his own creativity onto the image. As I remember him talking one time about the Schweitzer photograph. That's not a simple photograph. As a matter of fact, if you look in the foreground of that image.
Should I go back?
Yeah.
Sorry, everyone.
There we go.
We're talking about this one.
Yeah, as I recall him talking about the image, there was something in the foreground in the lower right-hand corner that he didn't like. And so I think he inserted the second image of the saw and the hand to make that image more impressive. also the whites really stand out. He used a lot of ferrocyanide to bring up those highlights and make that helmet and his shirt just jump out of the image. So he was a master printer in every sense of the word, and that often gets lost in translation.
May I offer a couple of comments on that? First of all, it's great to see Dr. Schaefer again. Saw him last night. I met Dr. Schaefer actually back when my dad was still alive in 1977, right when right after CCP was founded, and he was the president of the university, and was really responsible for bringing my dad here and getting this whole thing underway. So it's great to see you again. This is a great place to comment about, because and we could spend a whole hour just on these two topics. Okay, so in terms of the printing, I actually in terms of the printing, I think the Schweitzer with the lamp actually showcases it even more because it's a very dark, dimly lit scene. But you look at the flame and you look at his shirt, and then the light on his face compared with the background, and yes, that all was dodged and enhanced, and with the ferrocyanide, and I think the flame in this picture, and you see it with many others, like the whites and the brights are so bright, and as Becky knows, we do not allow. They have all the negatives here, but we allow no printing from the negatives whatsoever for any kind of reproduction, because you wouldn't recognize it. And it just, in fact, he himself, just two more little anecdotes here. He himself would, in fact, we have a couple of esteemed gallery owners here, Andy Smith, and I saw Terry Otherton as well. They know this well, the history of the market value of Gene Smith's prints. So he would spend his 5 days in the dark room, day and night with his scotch and his amphetamines, and work straight until he got the print exactly. He used a little like Dektol and acid fix as well to make the prints, not just scotch. But he'd get it just the way he wanted it, especially the really complex ones. Some of the ones from Pittsburgh, Smoky City, they almost look like impressionist paintings with the lights and darks and stuff. And then he himself, he wasn't going to spend 5 nights on making every single print that he offered, right, for sale or whatever. He would then take his own copy photograph of the print that he had just spent days getting just right. And then he would make his prints for sale from those. And this confused the heck out of the auction houses, because everybody goes, well, is this an original? Is this copy prints aren't worth anything? But in his case, they were. They weren't, if you could verify it, sometimes you couldn't tell the difference between, say, one that was actually printed in the 50s and one that was printed in the 60s or 70s. But he sort of established the art value in his own copy prints, which was unheard of, because that's what he could make and reproduce on a regular basis. One final comment about the hand and the saw, and we're having so many discussions today about, it first started with photoshopping, but now AI and artificial intelligence, and all kinds of photographers putting together composites of different negatives and what's original, what's so this was an example, and it was only revealed later. Now, if it's art, you can do whatever you want with it, right? But this is ostensibly supposed to be journalism, all right, for a major publication. He's on the staff of Life magazine. But yeah, there was some sort of blemish or flaw in the lower right-hand corner of this photograph. It was like a bleached spot or whatever. And so I'm not sure what this was from. I'm not sure whether this is a cutout. I'm not sure whether this was taken from another negative. I don't know that was ever documented, but it was superimposed by him to make the photograph more complete. Again, we could sit here all day as to whether that's justified, not justified, journalism, not journalism, but that's what it was. And there are a few other examples. It's also in that photo of the Spanish wake with the family. It's also pretty well documented that he bleached and adjusted the eyes of one of the two women who at that point had been looking at him rather than at the deceased subject, and he thought that was distracting, and so he redirected the eyes. Again, you wouldn't call that by the book journalism, but is what it is.
Other questions? Yeah, here in the middle.
After his war experience, did he turn into a pacifist? What did he think about the Cold War?
Interesting. I mean, he was anti-war. I mean, whether that makes him a pacifist or not, I'm sure he would think that there probably are some conflicts that are justified. I hadn't really stopped to think. I mean, I'm not sure what he would think about the current Russia-Ukraine conflict. I would presume he would be more sympathetic to the Ukrainian people, but I'm not sure whether he would sort of want a solution at all costs that would avoid fighting, or it's hard to know. I mean, he definitely had an anti-war perspective, and there's letters and notes and things in the CCP archive from him about how he hoped that his photographs of the war, would serve as a reminder of war's horror and inhumanity, and that we could avoid ever happening again. That didn't work out so well. But specifically about the Cold War, I don't know that I have a concrete answer for you.
The very end of that page that I read the quote from, he says, this is Gene Smith, "Actually, I have little hope that man has the intelligence to stop war, at least in his present stage of development. But I also feel with the strength of a religion that I must do everything that is in my physical and mental power to add my straw to the prevention or to the delaying of the next war." So, I mean, it's interesting to think about, when you watch war happen, how discouraged you get about people's potential, but that, he really felt committed that he needed to do what he could.
Yeah, and actually, if I can just add one other thing, I don't believe, I think this is true, I don't believe after World War II, I don't think he, like some photographers, kind of go from war to war. I mean, they are drawn to the conflict. I don't think he ever went to another war scene, but I will say that a number of the W.Eugene Smith grant recipients have been involved in photographing conflict in various places, and not both in Middle East, Palestinian, Israeli conflict, some other places. Not even just military, but even the violence of the drug cartels in Mexico, and so that's certainly an area that the grantors of the Smith Award have focused on and is kind of ripe for further coverage.
I think we might have time for one last question if anyone has one. There's one here, Denise, all the way in the back.
Hello. First part is, who were the kids in the Road to Paradise Garden?
Okay, that's a quick answer. It's not me. I get asked that all the time. That's my older brother, half brother Pat, who is still alive, and my half sister Juanita, who is deceased. She died of cancer. I don't know, 6-7 years ago, something like that. But it's not me, and they are older than me, and I assume the sort of fabled history of that photograph, which is after he was wounded in World War II, and there was the shot that Becky put up there with the bandages in the hospital. The story got embellished a lot over the years, right? But supposedly he was recuperating at home in upstate New York before he moved into the loft. And hadn't taken a photograph in a year, so he was wounded in 45, and back in 1946, he's in upstate New York. And the official version goes that he's kind of lying there, and he sees his two kids scampering around the backyard, and he hauls himself out of bed and picks up a camera, and the hands are shaking, and he kind of, captures them in this idyllic scene of, that's supposed to be, okay, this is my first photograph since the war. It's supposed to be the antidote to war. it's considered a universal image. It's so popular. It's an atypical Gene Smith image because it's not dark. Most of his images have a sort of darkness, both literally and metaphorically. But it's because it's shot from the back, and everybody says, "Oh, those look like my kids," you know, or those could be. I've seen my kids like that in the park, and so if it was shot from the front, it would have much less impact. But then you hear my half brother Pat or other people talk about it, and you know, apparently they were asked to walk back and forth like a dozen times. You know, it was unclear exactly whether it was the first photograph he ever shot afterwards. You know, it was or exactly when, or if it was only shot on one date. So some of those things are a little bit fuzzy in the details. But the legend lives on, as they say.
Oh, thank you. And one final thing, if you look at the pictures in the archives, not the fine prints, but other things in the Smith archive, you'll notice the excessive use of ferrocyanide and not the proper fixation or cleaning up afterwards. But his work is phenomenal.
Thank you. I'll take that as a good ending point.
Well, and we would invite you all to come see the beautiful prints in the exhibition and join us for a celebration of Gene Smith. And Kevin and I are around. Dr. Schaefer might be happy to answer your questions. So please do come and talk to us.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for coming. Thanks for having me.